It's a Thursday edition of the Bold Republic Radio Show, and that means we head on down to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where Maureen Bader is standing by patiently. Maureen, before I start in with the articles that you sent me, I had an idea, and I just wanted to get your opinion on this analogy, if you will. That would be on how government would fix your automobile if it broke down, okay? Have a committee meeting, shove some money in the glove compartment, and then stand in front of it and have your picture taken for the newspaper to show that you've done something. Would that about cover it?
Don't forget you have to go on the waiting list.
Oh, yeah, oh, good. I am glad I threw that by you. Okay, waiting list first. And by the way, the amount of money that has to be shoved into the glove compartment and handed out to everybody else far exceeds the amount of money if you had just taken it to a local guy to fix.
Oh, absolutely. Everything costs more with government.
Absolutely. Well, your articles that you can find, everybody can find at whyliberty.org, had to do with, really, and I was talking about this last hour, Maureen, invoking your name. Doesn't matter what. They're going to find a way to spend more money. I mean, when times are good, we have to spend money because all this money's rolling in on all of these fantastic projects. And when things are slowing down and times are bad, we have to spend more money because, well, there's all of these people in trouble and we need to spend money. And so apparently, Maureen,
the economy, right?
Yeah, that's the case in the state of Wyoming as well, is what you've been writing about.
Yeah, well, in fact, we did get a little bit of good news on the financial side of things during the last legislative session, and that was that after the legislature actually bailed out Governor Mead's deficit budget, it left a very, very small surplus. But not all was good news, of course. That's why we're on this show, right? A large part of the cash used to bail out the state's deficit came from one-time funds. We've got dark clouds on the horizon already for 2017-18. And so what we can talk about today is what we might expect for the next budget session, because the outlook is not rosy. If Governor Mead continues pushing for a rainy day fund raid instead of bringing the size of government down to a level citizens can afford to fund, you know what's going to happen? He's going to leave our children and grandchildren with a legacy of debt and higher taxes.
Okay, so real quick, you and I were chatting about this before you came on the program today. So part of the problem is up here in Gillette, Wyoming, there's quite a few people in the energy industry, especially drilling right now, that are saying the rigs are being shut down just because gas prices are so low. But then, of course, at the coal mines and at the power plants up here, they're worried about the EPA, and people are being laid off because of that. So doesn't the governor see this?
Well, it's kind of difficult to really know what he sees. I think he's looking forward for himself, and he's got his own plans, because what he really did have certainly was big spending plans for the supplemental budget that had to be reined in because, of course, we had a deficit in the 2015-16 biennial budget. So just as a bit of a backgrounder, what happens in Wyoming is that in 1 year, say 2014, the legislature will set the budget for the next biennium. So that's for the years 2015 and 2016. Now, we had a really big and sudden and quite unexpected drop in oil prices, and that meant that the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, that's the CREG that we've talked about before and people might often hear about, had overestimated state revenues during the 2014 budget session. So that meant that general fund spending based on those expectations left the state with a $222 million deficit for 2015-2016. So that meant the very first job facing the Joint Appropriations Committee, actually starting back in December, was to somehow cover off that $222 million deficit. And how it did that was by diverting $184 million from the Legislative Stabilization Reserve account, and that's what we often call the rainy day account. The legislature also took $34 million in 2013-14 reversions. A reversion was money that an agency had in its accounts, basically, that it had appropriated, but it hadn't spent yet. They had to give all that back. And then there was also $21 million sitting in something called a Strategic Investment and Projects account, which is sort of like a governor's checking account. And that gave the Joint Appropriations Committee and the legislature $239 million in extra cash. Now, the important thing to remember in all of this is that all of this money came from a one-time bonanza, and that's very, very unlikely to happen again this year. So this one-time bonanza paid for the deficit and left just under $18 million for the governor's supplemental budget request and any bills that were coming out of the session that required funds. Needless to say, the governor wanted much, much more than that. He actually requested 106. So here we are sitting with a $222 million deficit. What does he do? He comes out and requests an additional $167 million more in spending. I mean, this sort of goes to what we were talking about at the beginning. He seems to be a little bit disconnected with the realities of Wyoming families.
Okay, so wait, the money, could you say that these are for legitimate projects at all is the first question, but the second question is, if he is requesting all of this new spending, is there anywhere where he has proposed to cut?
No.
Okay.
No cutting, because, I mean, typically what we hear, and I'm going to write about this one in the future, is in fact, it was Bill Clinton who realized that if he said that government spending wasn't spending, but in fact investment, he could do a whole lot more of it. And that's essentially what Governor Mead has came out with back in December when he released the budget. He said, we've got all this money, it's hanging around in these accounts, we should invest it. Mm-hmm. So, politicians talk about investing, but really what they're talking about is spending, and that's what he wanted to do. He wants to continue to spend, and that's going to be a problem later on because we're looking at another deficit for the next biennium, and that budget is going to be set in January 2016. So after the budget went through the House, so we did actually see a bit of responsibility on the part of our elected legislators anyhow, because after the budget went through the House and the Senate, the legislature filled 9.3 of the governor's $167 million request. That was the smallest supplemental budget in decades. So then what it actually did have then was about $8 million left to cover any bills with appropriations. There was that uncompensated care bill that came out with a $2 million appropriation. That money came from there. So in total, the bills with requiring appropriations were about $3.5 million, and that left a very, very small budget surplus once all was finished. But what we have to ask ourselves is this going to be possible again next year? Well, I don't think so, because the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group with this Craig has already forecast a deficit of $338 million for the 2017-18 budget. And that is really going to depend on what happens with oil prices, because if oil prices don't go back and stay above $50 a barrel, that deficit is going to be a lot bigger.
Well, and again, we have to worry about things like the EPA, because if they continue doing what they're doing to the coal industry and the oil industry and the gas industry, and I just read another article about, you're going to love this if you didn't catch my last half hour, the federal government, especially the BLM, loses money on federal land. They don't make money on federal land. Now, if a private business were to get a hold of that federal land, they make money on it, but the federal government always seems to lose money on it. So I take a look at now between the environmental interest coming out of this administration, plus the what's happening in the oil industry as foreign countries flood the market, that could end up putting states like Wyoming into a recession.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what's the governor probably going to do next for the next budget? Is he going to call for another one of these? Remember, we talked a couple of years ago about his bogus budget cuts, or is he going to continue to talk about raiding the rainy day fund, or even worse, is he going to call for tax hikes? Now, I have an option. Don't laugh when I say this.
Okay, I promise.
Will he take a leadership role and call for real and permanent cuts to programs that fall outside the fundamental role of
How do you expect me not to laugh at that? I mean, it's just not possible. No, this guy, I wish that we had elected a fiscal conservative. God knows I voted for one, for governor of the state of Wyoming. But it looks to me like his plans are to constantly grow the state, the size of the state government. And I got to wonder, on a side note here, has he even addressed or done anything about the pension?
Oh no. Although there is an interim, that is one of the interim topics, but I'm quite convinced that we won't see any real reform on the government pension side until we have another big crisis like we had back in 2009.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing. You've got such entrenched special interests that the only way you're going to be able to really make real reforms is in an emergency situation, which is really too bad. But I mean, that's how government works. You know, they can't seem to get any real reforms done unless it's a crisis, because there's just no political will to do that, unfortunately.
We know what this sounds like to me, but here's one of those, correct me if I'm wrong, Maureen, and you always do. So let's take a look at what I thought was a stupid idea the first time I heard adults talk about it when I was a kid. And that would be a balloon mortgage payment, where you pay a nice, small, little comfortable rate for most of the time that you own the house. And then at the end, all of a sudden, you owe this massive balloon payment. And boy, you were supposed to be saving up and doing something about that. Well, it sounds to me like Governor Mead is doing the same thing. He's just pushing Obamacare does it too. Let's just push all of the expenditures down the road. So it looks good now on paper, but in a few years, it's a balloon payment. Is that right?
Oh, well, absolutely. What we saw, that is certainly what we saw with these bogus budget cuts in the Game and Fish Department a couple of years ago. Some of their biggest so-called cuts was just delaying maintenance. You know, that was their idea of a cut. We're not going to spend X on maintenance this year. We'll just wait until, you know, the good times return, and then we'll just, you know, spend even more on maintenance. That's why we need to look at a fundamental change in the way people think about government. I mean, you can't, and now, just to be fair, we really can't entirely blame politicians for this, because politicians, you know the classic, right? Politicians see which way the parade is going, and they jump to the front of the line. Now, if they're at the front of the line and they're talking about more spending, it's got to be because that's the way the parade is going.
Yeah.
So if most people are saying, you know, government, we want you to do something about this, and governments go ahead and their idea of doing things, of course, is spending your money and my money, well, we only have ourselves to blame when we see governments doing these things.
Interesting question for you, Maureen. At the federal levels, President Barack Obama is very good, even though he's not really supposed to be allowed to do this, at taking money from different agencies and using his pen to shuffle the money around to spend it on what he wants to spend it on. Can this governor, or does this governor, do anything like that?
Well, it's funny you would mention that. You know, as we were talking earlier, I really want to be sure that I haven't left an overly rosy outlook on what's going to be happening in the budget.
Oh, no, you definitely didn't do that. Don't worry about it.
Because, I mean, I've described it in a certain way, and I try to describe it so that it's easy to understand, but people need to understand that the budgeting process itself is actually extremely complicated. When we talk about a deficit, we're talking about the deficit in the state's traditional accounts. But the state, in fact, has hundreds of savings accounts. So try to think about it this way. Imagine you have 10 accounts, and you allocate your paycheck every month. At bill time, you take money from 2 of these accounts that you've allocated your money to. Let's call them your traditional accounts, and you use that to pay your bills. One day, your paycheck suddenly plunges, and you don't have enough flowing into these traditional accounts. No problem, you say. You can just divert the flow from some other account into your traditional accounts and pay your bills that way. Now, it seems like that's a good thing, but is it? Say, for instance, your spouse handles a third account, the one that pays for your children's schooling. Suddenly, school fees go up. Now, you still have enough money in the school account to pay the higher fees this year, but what will happen next year if your paycheck doesn't recover? You should probably start thinking about how you define a deficit, because after all, you only have one paycheck. Now, the Wyoming government has got to do the same thing. So remember we said that the legislature eliminated Governor Mead's 2015 supplemental budget deficit and ended up with a small budget surplus. That doesn't actually tell the whole story about Wyoming's financial situation, because one of the biggest spending hikes didn't even show up in this calculation, because it came not from the governor's traditional spending accounts, but from other funds. Now, this will cause pretty serious problems in the future, because money flowing into some of those other accounts are the same ones that filled the traditional accounts, and the reason we had a deficit was because of the declining tax revenue going into those accounts. And the Wyoming, I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about this, but the Wyoming school districts are a really good example. Now, school districts are funded not from traditional accounts, but from something called a school finance block grant funding model. Sounds complicated, and it is. About half of the funding for the block grant comes from the state's school foundation program account, and the other half comes from other local revenue sources. Now, the big problem is that some of the money flowing into the school foundation program account comes from federal mineral royalties. Those are royalties from oil and gas activity on federal lands, where, we talked about the BLM loses money. Now, these also flow into the governor's traditional spending accounts. Falling oil prices that caused Wyoming's deficit also hit the school foundation program account. That account lost $49.2 million in federal mineral royalties in fiscal year 2015-2016. Now, this problem is going to get much worse because the school finance block grant funding model is going to be recalibrated, which is government code for inflated, this year. So here we've got declining revenues and rising costs. You'd think we'd be talking about a deficit here, but no. In fact, making matters worse, school districts received $52.7 million extra outside of this block grant funding model in the 2013-2014 biennium, which means that school districts' block grant will inflate from a higher base. But it gets worse. I mean, we're talking about a horror story, and it's just like this Frankenstein is getting closer and closer. The school district representatives lobbied the government for even more money in the run-up to the January session, and as a result, the legislature approved yet another inflationary increase for school districts this session at $10.6 million. Here's the kicker. That increase was more than the governor's entire 2015 supplemental budget appropriation of $9.3 million. But the $10.6 million didn't show up as an addition to the deficit, because when we talk about the deficit, we're talking about a lack of money in the state's traditional accounts. And this is crazy.
It gets so complicated, it's hard to keep up with exactly where the money's flowing, maybe I'm wrong here, maybe I'm being conspiratorial, but sometimes I think that's intentional, to make the system so complicated. The average Joe could not possibly keep up with what's going on. You can. You're smart enough, you do it for a living.
Well, I've been at it for 3 years. I mean, I've been at this for 3 years now. I've finally got a reasonably good idea. Certainly no expert, but one of the initiatives we've been talking about here at Wyoming Liberty Group, and we're working with some of the more fiscally conservative legislators, and that is a budget simplification process. Because one of the things we hear often from some legislators is that it's completely transparent. Everything is there. Yeah, it might be there, but if nobody can understand it, what does that say for transparency?
Maureen, where do they follow your work at?
You can read more about this at wyliberty.org.
And as always, good to talk to you.
Great talking to you, too. Bye now.